Hi guys, my name is Nicole Riddy, and I am going to be discussing my older adult um, presentation using Eric Erickson's developmental stages. I decided to interview my grandmother. My grandmother is a very private person. When she goes to the doctor, she doesn't talk about things. She doesn't tell us a lot about her childhood. And so I've always kind of been very interested in what happened in her childhood, what happened in her early adult days, um, because it's something that she doesn't discuss. The earliest days that my grandmom discusses are when my parents were children. So I kind of took this as an opportunity to try to get to know her more and get to know where she came from. After interviewing my grandmother, I decided to use the developmental stage of intimacy versus isolation, which occurs in the early adulthood stage of a person's life. So I'll be exploring the ages of her early 20s into her early 40s. Um, so um, Eric Erikson emphasized that the ego makes a positive contribution to the development by mastering the attitudes, ideas, and skills at each stage of development. The mastery helps children grow into successful contributing members of society. During each of Erikson's 8 stages, there is a psychological conflict that must be successfully overcome in order for a child to develop into a healthy, well adjusted adult. Erikson proposed that we are motivated by the need to achieve competence in certain areas of our lives. And according to this psychosocial theory, we experience 8 different stages of development over our lifespan, from infancy through late adulthood. At each stage, there is a crisis or a task that we need to resolve. And if you resolve it successfully, during each developmental stage, it results in a sense of competence and a healthy personality. If you fail to complete these in a successful and positive way, a lot of negative, isolating, depression, those kind of feelings will arise. Um, so, a little bit about the 6th stage, which is intimacy versus isolation. Erikson believed that it was vital that people develop close and committed relationships with each other. These these emotionally intimate relationships as people enter adulthood play a critical role in the intimacy versus isolation stage. Such relationships are often romantic in nature, but he also believed that close friendships were also important. People who are successful in resolving the conflict of the intimacy versus isolation stage are able to develop deep, meaningful relationships with others. They have close, lasting romantic relationships, but they also can develop and maintain strong relationships with family and friends. The reason that the reason that I decided to work on this stage of her life was because a lot of this stage, my grandmother felt like she had to redefine herself. So, from the interview that I had with her, it seems as though she was able to gain a very successful sense of self. But that didn't show once it came into the next stage because um, in my slides, you will see that she was married at 20 years old. A year later, she moved to Virginia and lived on a Navy base while my grandfather was deployed on a naval ship, and so he wasn't around. Shortly after he deployed, my grandmother found out that she was pregnant. She had 3 children by the age of 27. She was the primary caregiver, housekeeper, disciplinarian, cook, everything. She ran the household. My grandfather was in the Navy up until probably like their 30s, like middle of their 30s. And so many times she stated that she felt like she was a single parent. When he retired from the Navy, he began to work at Beltel, which today is Verizon. Um, and it was kind of the same thing. He picked up many shifts. My grandmother did not work. So he picked up many shifts, many holidays. My grandmother did everything by herself. Um, and so she felt as though she was losing her sense of self that she had just gained and mastered in the previous stage. So, this stage to me was a little bit interesting because not only was she trying to develop and maintain important relationships, but she was also redefining herself. Um, and so I thought that that was very interesting that she kind of had to go back and redo one stage before she can move on to her new stage. Um, so my grandmother, they moved to Virginia, and while they were in Virginia, one of her big crises, her very first big crisis of this stage, was not having any family ties, any community ties, no relationships down in Virginia. It was just her and her daughter. My grandfather was away. She didn't get along with the other military wives. She was looked down upon because she came from up north. She didn't agree with a lot of the culture. So up here, my grandmom lived in a multi-ethnic community. Um, my grandmother was never someone who saw skin color to be an issue, and when she moved down south, it became a very big issue that that was the way that she believed and the way she saw the world. Um, she felt as though the church didn't speak to her the way the church up here spoke to her. So she became very depressed and she felt isolated. So that was a very big crisis because, according to Erickson's theory, that would mean that she did not successfully master the crisis of her previous stage. I know from her interview that it seems as though she did, but possibly internally she did not because she was not able to develop, maintain, and create these new healthy friendships and attachments to this new group of people. Um, and instead of staying and working through this to try, my grandmother, after her second child, moved back to Philadelphia and lived with her mother and regained her church. She regained her community, her friends, her family, everyone that was important to her. So she went back into her comfort zone. Um, she did this, and when my grandfather came back from the military, he got moved to Philadelphia, so it was okay. Um, and then they went and raised their children together. But even at that time, she felt sometimes like she was isolated and alone. I also related this scenario to the developmental, I'm sorry, to the theory of cognitive development. The reason that I did this was because she was unable to adapt to the culture change that she was experiencing. And she didn't understand it because it was a completely different way of living in Philadelphia. And so, in this theory, there is this idea of adaptation. I'm sorry. There's this idea of adaptation and how a child, as they cognitively develop, should be able to adapt to different scenarios, different environments, different cultures, different situations, and they should be able to alter their way that they view the world according to what they have experienced. Um, my grandmother was unable to do that. She does bring certain things from down south, like she cooks a little bit different now, and she brings things from down south in her cooking, in the way she cleans her home, and different things of that sort. Um, but to this day, my grandmother has a very ill taste in her mouth for the South. Um, and so that is my project. I also included a picture of my grandmother. It is from her high school days, but that's really the only picture I could find of her by herself. And it's in my presentation. So thank you for learning about my grandmother with me.